December 7th. 1941, the day Pearl Harbor burned marked the beginning of a war that would be decided not merely by bullets and bombs, but by something far more fundamental: food. As Japanese Zeros screamed through Hawaiian skies and American battleships erupted in flames, few could have imagined that the outcome of this massive Pacific conflict would ultimately hinge on something as mundane as daily calorie intake. Yet within 4 years, skeletal Japanese soldiers would face robust American GIs across jungle battlefields, and the contrast would tell the story of two nations' vastly different capacities to wage industrial warfare. The Japanese Imperial Army had always prided itself on spiritual strength over material comfort. For generations, Japanese military philosophy emphasized seishin, the power of spirit, teaching soldiers that willpower could overcome physical deprivation. Officers regularly declared that Japanese warriors needed less food than their Western counterparts, that rice and pickled vegetables sufficed where Americans required steaks and potatoes. This wasn't merely propaganda. It reflected genuine cultural beliefs about endurance and sacrifice. Japanese training regimens deliberately incorporated hunger as a tool to toughen soldiers, preparing them for the hardships of campaign life. In stark contrast, the United States military had spent the interwar years developing what historians would later recognize as the most sophisticated logistics system ever conceived. American war planners understood that industrial-age warfare demanded industrial-age nutrition. They calculated precise caloric requirements for men engaged in combat operations, factored in environmental stresses, and designed supply chains capable of delivering hot meals to soldiers fighting thousands of miles from home. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had become a science unto itself, employing nutritionists, dietitians, and logistics experts who treated feeding soldiers as seriously as equipping them with weapons. The disparity became apparent almost immediately after hostilities began. Japanese soldiers advancing through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines during the early months of 1942 carried minimal rations, expecting to live off conquered territories. This strategy, called living off the land, or Genko, worked temporarily while Japanese forces swept through resource regions. Soldiers supplemented their meager rice allotments with captured British tinned goods, Dutch colonial stores, and local produce. For a brief moment, the Japanese seemed vindicated in their approach. American forces, meanwhile, retreated in disarray, but never abandoned their supply infrastructure. Even during the desperate defense of Bataan, American quartermasters attempted to maintain regular feeding schedules. When Douglas MacArthur evacuated to Australia, he took with him not just military intelligence, but detailed logistics specialists who would begin planning the massive supply operations necessary to return. According to nutritional records preserved in the National Archives and analyzed in John McManus's comprehensive work, Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, American soldiers in the Pacific were allocated approximately 4,000 calories daily during active operations, enough to sustain men engaged in intense physical activity in tropical heat. Japanese rations, by comparison, aimed for roughly 2,000 calories under ideal conditions, a target that would prove increasingly impossible to meet as the war progressed and Allied submarines strangled Japan's maritime supply routes. The calorie gap had opened, it would only widen. The scale of American food production during World War II bordered on the miraculous. Across the continental United States, farmland that had struggled through the Great Depression suddenly roared to life with wartime demand. Farmers who had once plowed crops under to maintain prices now cultivated every available acre. The U.S. government guaranteed purchases, subsidized equipment, and deferred agricultural workers from the draft. American farms became weapons factories of a different sort, churning out millions of tons of wheat, corn, beef, pork, and dairy products that would feed not only American troops but Allied forces worldwide. The infrastructure supporting this agricultural miracle was equally impressive. Refrigerated railroad cars transported perishables from farms to ports. Massive warehouses in San Francisco, Seattle, and San Diego received, sorted, and repackaged foodstuffs for Pacific deployment. The military developed new preservation techniques, dehydrated eggs, powdered milk, canned fruits and vegetables that could withstand tropical humidity. Scientists worked tirelessly to create field rations that balanced nutrition, portability, and palatability. American soldiers ate astonishingly well by any historical military standard. The famous ration, developed in 1938 and refined throughout the war, provided complete meals in portable cans. Each ration included a meat component, beef stew, pork and beans, ham and lima beans, plus crackers, candy, cigarettes, and even toilet paper. The ration, designed for paratroopers and mobile forces, offered breakfast, dinner, and supper variations with items like processed cheese, fruit bars, and bouillon powder. Soldiers complained about the monotony, but these rations delivered genuine sustenance. Beyond field rations, wherever American forces established semi-permanent bases, hot meal facilities appeared with remarkable speed. So best the Navy's construction battalions built mess halls and bakeries within days of securing beachheads. Ships carried mobile kitchens that could serve hundreds of men hot meals, even in combat zones. The commitment to feeding troops properly extended beyond mere calories. Military planners recognized that varied, palatable food maintained morale as effectively as mail from home. The privilege of abundance shaped American soldiers physically and psychologically. The average American recruit entering the military stood approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed around 155 pounds, figures representing the best-fed generation in human history to that point. Most young Americans had grown up drinking milk daily, eating meat regularly, and consuming sufficient fruits and vegetables to prevent deficiency diseases that plagued earlier generations and contemporaries in less developed nations. This nutritional advantage translated directly into military capability. Well-fed American soldiers could march longer distances, dig entrenchments faster, and maintain alertness during extended operations. They recovered more quickly from wounds and illnesses. Their immune systems, bolstered by adequate nutrition, fought off tropical diseases more effectively than malnourished counterparts. Naval medical officers reported that American sailors in the Pacific, despite heat stress and combat trauma, maintained relatively stable health profiles when properly supplied. The supply ships themselves told the story of American industrial might. Liberty ships built in staggering numbers by shipyards working around the clock carried holds full of provisions across the Pacific. Destroyers, cruisers, and battleships devoted significant space to food storage, with refrigerated compartments maintaining fresh provisions for crews. Aircraft carriers operated full bakeries and butcher shops, producing fresh bread and preparing meat for thousands of sailors. The U.S. Navy's floating logistics train was so extensive that ships could remain at sea for months without depleting food stocks. This abundance wasn't accidental or incidental, it represented deliberate national policy. American military doctrine held that soldiers fought better when treated well, that investment in creature comforts paid dividends in combat effectiveness. While some officers from older military traditions criticized this approach as soft, results proved its validity. Japan entered World War II with a fundamentally different nutritional reality. The Japanese home islands, densely populated and resource-poor, had struggled with food security for decades. Rice, a staple of Japanese diet, had to be imported from Korea and Taiwan to feed the civilian population adequately. Protein sources remained limited. Fish provided most animal proteins, supplemented by small amounts of pork and chicken. The average Japanese civilian consumed approximately 2,000 to 2,200 calories daily during the late 1930s, adequate for sedentary life, but insufficient for sustained physical labor. Japanese military rations reflected these constraints. The standard Japanese soldier's daily allotment consisted primarily of rice, roughly 28 ounces, supplemented by barley, miso paste, pickled vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of canned fish or meat. In theory, this provided around 2,400 calories, enough to sustain moderate activity. In practice, field conditions rarely allowed soldiers to receive full rations, and the monotonous diet lacked essential vitamins and nutrients found in more varied Western diets. The Japanese military's attitude toward food combined practical acceptance of scarcity with ideological glorification of deprivation. Officers indoctrinated soldiers with stories of samurai warriors who conquered hunger through meditation and discipline. Training regimens deliberately included long marches on minimal rations, designed to prove that Japanese troops could function where softer Western soldiers would collapse. This wasn't entirely fantasy. Japanese soldiers did demonstrate remarkable endurance under conditions that would have broken poorly trained forces. However, ideology couldn't alter biochemistry. Chronic undernourishment produced measurable physical effects. Japanese soldiers tended to be shorter and lighter than American counterparts. The average Japanese recruit stood approximately 5 feet 3 inches and weighed around 125 pounds. While some of this reflected genetic differences, nutrition played a significant role. More critically, soldiers operating on borderline adequate calories possessed minimal reserves when disease, injury, or increased operational tempo created additional demands. Japan's military strategy compounded these nutritional vulnerabilities. The rapid expansion across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in 1942 created supply lines stretching thousands of miles from home islands already struggling to feed themselves. Japanese war planners anticipated that conquered territories would provide food for occupying forces, a calculation that proved partially correct initially but catastrophically wrong as the war progressed. Local populations in occupied territories had their own subsistence needs. Requisitioning food from them created resentment and resistance while never fully meeting Japanese military requirements. Furthermore, Japanese logistics capabilities lagged far behind American equivalents. Japan possessed fewer cargo ships, less sophisticated preservation technology, and more fragile supply infrastructure. The Japanese merchant marine, though substantial at war's outset, couldn't match the scale of American shipping. Japanese supply officers worked minor miracles keeping forces fed during early campaigns, but the system operated near capacity with minimal redundancy. Context from military historians' analyses, particularly those documented in Edward Drees' Japan's Imperial Army, its rise and fall, reveals that Japanese supply planning often relied on optimistic assumptions about campaign durations and local resource availability. When battles extended beyond anticipated timelines or forces found themselves in resource-poor environments, food shortages appeared almost immediately. Guadalcanal would become the first major demonstration of this systemic vulnerability. Cultural factors intensified the problem. Japanese military culture stigmatized complaining about hardship, including hunger. Soldiers suffering severe malnutrition often concealed their condition to avoid appearing weak. Officers prioritized ammunition and fuel over food and supply allocation decisions, reasoning that combat effectiveness mattered more than comfort. This mindset made sense in short-term tactical situations, but proved catastrophic in extended campaigns. The Japanese home front, meanwhile, experienced increasing food stress as the war continued. Urban rationing began in 1941 and tightened steadily. Rice allotments decreased, while substitute grains of inferior nutritional quality appeared more frequently. Protein sources became scarce luxuries rather than daily staples. Unlike America, where agricultural production expanded during wartime, Japanese food production stagnated and then declined as labor and fertilizer shortages worsened. August 7, 1942, marked the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign, where the calorie gap between American and Japanese forces would first manifest in blood and bone. When U.S. Marines stormed ashore on this obscure Solomon Islands speck, they triggered a 6-month battle that would become infamous, not merely for its ferocity but for reducing thousands of Japanese soldiers to walking skeletons. Men who died not from bullets, but from the slow agony of starvation. The campaign began promisingly enough for Japanese forces. After the initial American landing surprised and displaced the small Japanese garrison, Imperial General Headquarters dispatched reinforcements determined to recapture the strategically vital airfield the Americans called Henderson Field. The Japanese landed elite troopsmen of the Ichiki detachment. Battle-hardened veterans confident in their superiority, they carried standard rations and expected the campaign to conclude within weeks. Those weeks became months. American control of Henderson Field meant American aircraft dominated the skies during daylight hours, making Japanese resupply operations desperately dangerous. Japanese ships could only approach Guadalcanal at night, using fast destroyers and what Americans dubbed the Tokyo Express runs. These nighttime missions delivered reinforcements and ammunition, but rarely adequate food supplies. Destroyers couldn't carry the volume of provisions needed to feed thousands of soldiers. Priority went to weapons and fresh troops. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal found themselves in a green hell that offered little sustenance. The jungle, while visually lush, provided minimal edible resources. Native vegetation included toxic plants that caused severe illness when consumed by desperate men. Animals proved scarce and wary. Hunting required time and ammunition soldiers couldn't spare. The Luna River provided water, but also harbored parasites that caused dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases, further compromising soldiers' ability to absorb nutrients from their meager rations. Within 8 weeks of sustained operations, Japanese rations on Guadalcanal had fallen to crisis levels. Soldiers received perhaps half their standard rice allotment, 14 ounces daily or less, with almost no supplementary foods. Men began exhibiting signs of caloric deficit, weight loss, fatigue, decreased mental acuity, and increased susceptibility to disease. Tropical ailments, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery ravaged formations whose immune systems had been compromised by malnutrition. Soldiers who might have recovered from illness with adequate nutrition instead wasted away, caught in a vicious cycle where disease reduced appetite while increasing caloric requirements. The situation deteriorated catastrophically in October and November of 1942, as American naval and air power increasingly interdicted Japanese supply runs. The November 13th through 15th Naval Battle of Guadalcanal effectively sealed the island off from major reinforcement or resupply. Japanese forces ashore, numbering approximately 20,000 men, faced starvation with no prospect of relief. Diary entries recovered from dead Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, preserved in military archives, and documented in Richard Frank's authoritative Guadalcanal. The definitive account of the landmark battle provide harrowing testimony to the hunger that consumed the Japanese army. One sergeant wrote in early December 1942, "Fourth day without food. Strength failing, comrades too weak to move, officers eat tree bark. Is this how the Emperor's soldiers perish?" Another entry dated December 20th. "Found snail. Fought with Tanaka over it. He won. Tomorrow we'll search for roots. Many cannot walk now." American forces, meanwhile, maintained regular feeding schedules despite their own supply challenges. The Marines who landed in August subsisted initially on captured Japanese rice stocks and canned goods brought ashore during the landing. Within days, however, American supply ships began arriving with standard rations. Though Japanese air attacks and submarine operations disrupted supply initially, American logistics proved remarkably resilient. Even during the campaign's most difficult period in September, when Japanese naval forces threatened to cut American supply lines completely, Marines received at least 2 meals daily. The nutritional contrast became viscerally apparent in combat. American patrols encountering Japanese positions in late 1942 reported enemy soldiers so emaciated they could barely hold weapons. Japanese attacks, once characterized by ferocious energy, became sluggish affairs conducted by men who lacked the physical strength for sustained combat. Some Japanese soldiers died not from battle wounds, but from sheer exhaustion after brief firefights. January 4th. 1943 witnessed one of the Pacific War's most pathetic spectacles, the Japanese evacuation from Guadalcanal. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers, the remnants of forces that had once numbered over 30,000, began withdrawing westward along jungle trails toward evacuation points. This wasn't a tactical retreat, but a death march, a desperate exodus of starving men pursued by well-fed American forces who found the jungle littered with bodies of soldiers who simply collapsed and died. The evacuation order came from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a tacit admission that Guadalcanal could not be held. The decision sparked debate among Japanese commanders. Some argued for fighting to annihilation rather than accepting the humiliation of retreat. Practicality prevailed, barely. The plan called for soldiers to march overland to Cape Esperance, on Guadalcanal's northwestern tip, where destroyers would evacuate them during early February. The distance, roughly 40 miles through mountainous jungle terrain, would have challenged healthy troops. For men who had been starving for months, it became an ordeal that killed hundreds. Survivors described the march in nightmarish terms. Soldiers staggered forward on swollen legs, their bodies cannibalizing muscle tissue to provide energy in the absence of dietary calories. Men's gums bled from scurvy, their night vision failed from vitamin A deficiency, their minds wandered from malnutrition-induced delirium. Some soldiers simply sat down beside the trail, too exhausted to continue, waiting for death or American patrols, whichever arrived first. Others became separated from their units in the jungle darkness, dying alone and unrecorded. The physical deterioration shocked even hardened Japanese officers. Lieutenant Colonel Kumamoto, an operations staff officer who participated in the evacuation, later testified that many soldiers weighed less than 90 pounds, their uniforms hanging loosely on skeletal frames. Some men had developed the distended bellies characteristic of severe protein deficiency, a condition called kwashiorkor more commonly associated with famine victims than combat troops. Others exhibited beriberi symptoms, swollen legs, heart problems, neurological dysfunction from prolonged thiamine deficiency caused by subsisting almost entirely on polished white rice when any food was available at all. American forces pursuing the Japanese retreat encountered scenes that stunned combat veterans. Marine patrols found abandoned positions littered with emaciated corpses, men who had died not from wounds but from organ failure induced by starvation. Some Japanese soldiers were discovered barely alive, too weak to flee, offering no resistance when captured. Medical corpsmen examining these prisoners reported vital signs so poor they wondered how the men had remained conscious. Many prisoners died within hours of capture despite immediate medical attention and feeding, their systems too compromised to process nourishment. The evacuation itself, conducted by a destroyer during early February, saved perhaps 10,000 Japanese soldiers from Guadalcanal. Those who reached evacuation points were transported to Rabaul and other rear areas. They required weeks of careful rehabilitation before returning to anything resembling combat readiness. Many never fully recovered. Chronic health problems stemming from prolonged starvation plagued survivors for years afterward. Guadalcanal established a grim pattern that would repeat throughout the Pacific War. Japanese forces, initially confident and aggressive, would find themselves isolated and undersupplied. American submarines and aircraft would interdict supply lines. Japanese soldiers would exhaust stockpiles and begin starving. Combat effectiveness would collapse not from battlefield defeats but from systemic nutritional failure. The Emperor's warriors, trained to overcome physical hardship through spiritual strength, discovered that willpower couldn't compensate for absent calories. The lessons from Guadalcanal were clear to American observers. Maintaining robust supply lines wasn't merely logistically preferable, it was operationally essential. The U.S. military's investment in logistics infrastructure, criticized by some as excessive, had proven its worth. Well-fed American forces had outlasted nominally superior Japanese troops not through better tactics or equipment alone, but through something more fundamental, the ability to keep soldiers properly nourished in the field. Japanese military leadership drew different conclusions, unfortunately for their soldiers. Rather than recognizing systemic logistics inadequacies, many officers attributed Guadalcanal's outcome to tactical errors, insufficient fighting spirit, or bad luck. The narrative emphasized heroic sacrifice rather than organizational failure. This interpretation meant subsequent operations continued to rely on the same flawed supply assumptions, condemning tens of thousands more Japanese soldiers to death by starvation in campaigns across New Guinea, the Philippines, and Burma. The Guadalcanal Death March became legendary within both militaries, though for different reasons. American forces remembered it as evidence that Japanese soldiers, despite their fearsome reputation, were vulnerable to the same physical limitations as all humans. Japanese survivors carried it as a badge of supreme sacrifice, proof they had endured beyond human limits. Neither interpretation fully captured the real lesson that modern industrial warfare rewarded nations capable of sustaining their forces logistically and punished those that could not. New Guinea became the Pacific War's largest graveyard for Japanese soldiers, and most died not in combat, but from starvation and disease, amplified by malnutrition. This massive island north of Australia saw continuous fighting from 1942 through 1945. With Japanese forces repeatedly finding themselves trapped in mountainous jungles where supply failures transformed military formations into helpless collections of dying men. The New Guinea campaign began in July 1942, when Japanese forces landed on the island's northern coast, intending to capture Port Moresby on the southern coast and threaten Australia directly. The plan called for troops to cross the Owen Stanley Range, a formidable mountain chain reaching over 13,000 feet, via the Kokoda Track, a narrow trail through some of Earth's most inhospitable terrain. Japanese planners allocated minimal supplies, expecting the campaign to conclude within weeks. Instead, it became a protracted nightmare extending into 1943 and beyond. The Kokoda Track campaign demonstrated how terrain and supply failures created deadly synergies. Japanese soldiers, carrying perhaps 10 days of rations, faced weeks of marching through steep mountains and dense jungle, where every step required tremendous physical exertion. The trail climbed to elevations where temperatures dropped near freezing at night, then descended into lowland swamps breeding malarial mosquitoes. Soldiers burned calories at prodigious rates, 5,000 or more daily, while their rations provided less than half that amount. Australian forces defending the Kokoda Track, though initially outnumbered, maintained supply lines that airdrops supplemented when ground transport proved impossible. Australian and American aircraft could parachute supplies to forward positions, ensuring defenders received food even in remote mountain camps. Japanese forces lacked equivalent air transport capacity. Their supply lines extended over land through the same mountainous jungle their soldiers struggled to traverse while fighting. By September 1942, Japanese forces on the Kokoda Track were starving again, just as their comrades on Guadalcanal were. Soldiers subsisted on handfuls of rice, supplemented by whatever they could forage. A futile exercise in rainforests where edible plants required knowledge most. Japanese soldiers lacked. Men developed the now familiar symptoms of severe caloric deficit, dramatic weight loss, chronic diarrhea from desperate consumption of contaminated water and questionable vegetation, ulcerated skin infections that wouldn't heal, and progressive weakness that made movement torturous. The situation in New Guinea's coastal regions proved equally catastrophic for Japanese forces. Around Bunagona and Sananandas, small settlements where Japanese forces established defensive positions, supply problems created pockets of starving soldiers that Australian and American forces besieged from late 1942 into early 1943. Japanese defenders dug into elaborate bunker systems, initially fought with characteristic tenacity. But as weeks passed without resupply, their resistance weakened noticeably. Allied soldiers attacking these positions reported increasingly disturbing discoveries. Japanese bunkers contained corpses of soldiers who had starved to death at their posts. Supply dumps, when overrun, revealed empty storage buildings that should have contained food stocks. Captured Japanese medical facilities showed conditions resembling concentration camps, more than military hospitals, row after row of skeletal patients dying from malnutrition-related illnesses that overwhelmed doctors lacking medicines or food to treat them. The scale of death from non-combat causes in New Guinea was staggering. Of approximately 160,000 Japanese soldiers deployed to New Guinea during the war, approximately 127,000 died, and the majority of casualties resulted from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. Australian military historians examining campaign records calculated that for every Japanese soldier killed in action, 3 died from hunger, illness, or combination thereof. These figures documented in extensive post-war analyses including Peter Williams and David Wallace's Unit 731, Japan's secret biological warfare in World War II, represented one of history's great military catastrophes. American forces entering New Guinea in larger numbers during 1943 brought with them the same logistical capabilities that had sustained them at Guadalcanal, now refined and expanded. Engineers carved airstrips from jungle, enabling transport aircraft to deliver supplies directly to forward areas. Seabees constructed wharves and roads, establishing infrastructure that kept food, ammunition, and medical supplies flowing steadily. American soldiers complained about monotonous sea rations and canned spam. Never realizing their complaints themselves, testified to their privileged position, they had sufficient food to become bored with it. Military physicians on both sides documented the medical consequences of the Pacific War's nutritional disparity, creating a grim scientific record of what happens to soldiers operating under sustained caloric deprivation. Japanese military hospitals filled with patients suffering conditions rarely seen in modern warfare. Diseases of malnutrition that military medicine had largely eliminated in Western armies decades earlier. Beriberi caused by thiamine vitamin B1 deficiency became epidemic among Japanese forces. The disease presented in 2 forms, both devastating. Wet beriberi caused fluid accumulation and cardiovascular dysfunction. Soldiers developed swollen legs, shortness of breath, and eventually heart failure. Dry berry attacked the nervous system, causing numbness, weakness, and paralysis, that rendered soldiers unable to walk or use their hands. The irony was bitter. White rice, the staple of Japanese military rations, had been stripped of its thiamine-rich outer layers during polishing. Soldiers were literally eating the cause of their illness. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that had plagued sailors for centuries, reappeared among Japanese troops denied fresh fruits and vegetables for extended periods. Soldiers' gums became spongy and bled easily, their teeth loosened, wounds refused to heal, and old injuries reopened spontaneously. In advanced cases, subcutaneous bleeding created bruises across the body. Some men's leg wounds from minor injuries weeks earlier suddenly burst open, bleeding internally as collagen structures broke down from vitamin C absence. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency affected thousands of Japanese soldiers. A tactical disaster that compromised their ability to conduct the nighttime operations Japanese doctrine favored. Men who had possessed normal vision found themselves stumbling helplessly in darkness, unable to navigate jungle trails or aim weapons after sunset. This condition is light preventable with adequate diet, including animal products and yellow-orange vegetables. It became sufficiently common that Japanese officers had to adjust operational planning around affected troops. Protein narrage malnutrition, the medical term for combined calorie and protein deficiency, created the most visible symptoms. Japanese soldiers in advanced stages developed marasmus, characterized by extreme wasting, where the body consumed its own muscle tissue and organs for energy. These men appeared skeletal, their ribs and bones prominent beneath loose skin, their faces gaunt with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. Inkot. Others developed kwashiorkor, marked by swollen bellies despite overall emaciation caused by protein deficiency that disrupted fluid balance and liver function. Both conditions carried high mortality rates, even with treatment. Infectious diseases hit malnourished Japanese soldiers with devastating effect. Malaria, dysentery, dengue, fever, tuberculosis, and other tropical ailments found easy victims in men whose immune systems had been compromised by inadequate nutrition. Medical officers reported that soldiers who contracted malaria while malnourished often died from the infection, whereas well-nourished troops typically recovered. Dysentery, normally an unpleasant but survivable condition, became a death sentence for starving men whose bodies couldn't replace lost fluids and electrolytes. The psychological effects of starvation received less documentation, but were equally significant. Chronic hunger affects cognitive function, reducing soldiers' ability to make decisions, follow orders, maintain alertness, or function effectively in combat. Starving men became obsessed with food, their thoughts circling endlessly around memories of meals and fantasies of eating. This mental state undermined unit cohesion and discipline. Soldiers stole from each other, hoarded scraps, and sometimes refused orders to prioritize searching for food. American military physicians, observing these conditions in captured Japanese soldiers, documented the findings for training and intelligence purposes. Medical reports noted the stark physical differences between American servicemen and Japanese prisoners. The average American soldier maintained stable weight and health throughout deployment when supply lines functioned normally. Captured Japanese soldiers, by contrast, averaged 30 to 50 pounds underweight, with the most severe cases showing losses of 60 pounds or more from their already lighter baseline body weights. One particularly detailed analysis, conducted by U.S. Army medical officers at a prisoner of war camp in Australia during 1943, examined 200 captured Japanese soldiers from New Guinea. The study found that 92% showed signs of malnutrition, 78% suffered from beriberi, 65% had parasitic infections, and 43% exhibited multiple deficiency diseases simultaneously. Nearly all prisoners required extended medical treatment before they could perform even light physical labor. Several died despite care, their bodies too damaged to recover. These medical realities translated directly into military effectiveness. Malnourished soldiers couldn't march as far, dig trenches as quickly, or fight as effectively as well-fed counterparts. They tired easily, recovered slowly from exertion, and succumbed more readily to wounds that healthy soldiers would survive. The Japanese military's spiritual emphasis on overcoming physical limitations through willpower encountered the brutal biological reality that human bodies require specific nutrients in specific quantities to function. While Japanese soldiers starved across the Pacific, the American military logistics system evolved into arguably history's most sophisticated food distribution network. The United States had perfected the science of feeding millions of soldiers deployed across 2 oceans and multiple continents simultaneously. A feat of organizational capability that contributed as much to Allied victory as any weapon system. The numbers were staggering. By mid-1944, the U.S. military was feeding approximately 12 million service members worldwide, plus providing substantial food aid to Allied nations and civilian populations in liberated territories. This required procuring, processing, transporting, and distributing roughly 60 million pounds of food daily, enough to feed a nation the size of Australia. The Quartermaster Corps, responsible for this mission, operated what amounted to the world's largest restaurant chain, with locations spanning from Alaska to Australia, Britain to Burma. Innovations in food preservation and packaging enabled this global feeding operation. The advent of improved canning techniques meant meat, vegetables, and fruits retained nutritional value for months or years without refrigeration. Dehydration technology removed water weight from eggs, potatoes, milk, and other foods, reducing shipping volume while preserving nutrition critical when cargo space determined how much could be delivered to distant island bases. These technological advances, developed through government-funded research programs, gave American forces dietary variety impossible for enemies to match. The famous ration represented American food technology's apex. Developed by physiologist Unseld Keys and introduced in 1942. This compact meal package contained approximately 3,000 calories across 3 meal units: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each unit included a meat product, canned ham, cheese or sausage, crackers or biscuits, a candy bar, powdered beverage, and cigarettes. The entire day's ration weighed just over 2 pounds, light enough for mobile operations yet nutritionally complete. Soldiers could survive indefinitely on rations without developing deficiency diseases, a claim no other military's field rations could match. Beyond field rations, the American military's commitment to hot meals wherever possible set it apart. Engineers and CBs constructed mess facilities with remarkable speed on captured islands, often having kitchens operational within days of securing a beachhead. These facilities served meals that, while utilitarian, included meat, potatoes, or rice, vegetables, bread, and dessert meals that would have seemed fantastical luxury to Japanese soldiers subsisting on rice balls. Thanksgiving dinner 1944 saw American forces across the Pacific served turkey with all traditional accompaniments, a propaganda coup that wasn't lost on hungry Japanese soldiers monitoring enemy radio broadcasts. Supply ships plying Pacific routes carried refrigerated holds full of frozen meat, fresh vegetables when available, and dairy products. Fleet oilers, beyond delivering fuel, also transported food supplies to combat groups operating far from bases. The logistics of keeping ice cream frozen while sailing through tropical waters, or ensuring fresh lettuce reached island garrisons, seemed almost absurdly excessive. Yet these efforts maintained morale and health among forces enduring brutal combat conditions. Medical understanding supported these logistics efforts. Army nutritionists had calculated that soldiers engaged in heavy labor in tropical climates required 4,000 to 4,500 calories daily to maintain body weight and combat effectiveness. Rations were designed to meet this requirement while providing balanced nutrients, adequate protein for muscle maintenance, sufficient vitamins to prevent deficiency diseases, and enough variety to remain palatable over extended periods. When soldiers did develop nutritional deficiencies, usually due to temporary supply disruptions, medical officers quickly identified and corrected the problems. The submarine service received special attention. Submariners, confined in cramped spaces for extended patrols, ate perhaps the best food in the military. Submarine galleys, though tiny, were staffed by specially trained cooks who prepared multiple hot meals daily from extensive food stores. Fresh provisions lasted the first days of patrol, then gave way to frozen and canned goods, but quality remained high. This wasn't mere indulgence. Submarine commanders understood that good food maintained crew morale during the psychological stress of undersea warfare. Even prisoners received adequate nutrition under American custody. Geneva Convention obligations aside, American military policy held that well-fed prisoners provided better intelligence and required less medical care than starving ones. Japanese prisoners in American camps gained weight, recovered from malnutrition-related ailments, and often expressed shock at the quantity and quality of food provided. This humane treatment occasionally created awkward situations where Japanese prisoners ate better than their own army had ever fed them. The contrast extended to rear areas. American soldiers on leave in Australia, New Zealand, or Hawaii found restaurants, clubs, and canteens serving familiar American food. These recreational facilities, while primarily boosting morale, also ensured soldiers returned to combat duty nutritionally robust. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, rarely rotated to rear areas for rest, and when they did, food quality often differed little from frontline rations. The Philippine campaign of 1944 through 45 witnessed the calorie gap's ultimate expression, with hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers trapped on islands where American naval blockades prevented resupply. What followed was the Pacific War's largest starvation event, killing more Japanese troops than died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines in October 1944 initiated a massive American offensive that would eventually involve over 200,000 American troops supported by overwhelming air and naval superiority. Japanese forces, numbering approximately 270,000 soldiers, were dispersed across the archipelago's many islands under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita. From the campaign's outset, Yamashita recognized that American control of sea and air meant his forces would receive no resupply. They would have to live on stockpiled provisions and whatever they could requisition locally. Those stockpiles proved woefully inadequate for extended operations. Japanese supply planning had assumed naval access would continue, enabling regular cargo deliveries to maintain forces. When American submarines and aircraft cut those sea lanes completely, Japanese units found themselves besieged on islands that couldn't support large military populations. The Philippines, though agriculturally productive, couldn't generate surplus food for both civilian populations and massive military concentrations. Japanese requisitioning created food shortages for Filipino civilians, who understandably had no interest in starving to feed an occupying army. The situation on Luzon, the Philippines' main island, deteriorated catastrophically through early 1945. Japanese forces withdrew into mountainous interior regions, abandoning coastal areas to American control. These mountains, while defensible, offered minimal food resources. Soldiers began subsisting on whatever they could scavenge: tree bark, grass, roots, insects, snakes, lizards, and eventually anything remotely organic. Units that had initially maintained discipline descended into desperate groups where survival eclipsed military duty. Diary entries recovered from dead Japanese soldiers in the Philippines chronicled the descent into starvation with horrifying detail. One lieutenant wrote in March 1945, "Men are eating leather from boots and belts. Tried myself impossible to digest. Yes. 5 soldiers died yesterday, not from wounds but from weakness. Cannot remember last proper meal. Even officers receive no rations now." Another soldier recorded in April, Yamamoto discovered eating human flesh from dead comrade. "Court-martial impossible, we are all dying. Who can judge the starving?" These accounts preserved in Japanese military archives and cited in John Toland's The Rising Sun. The decline and fall of the Japanese Empire revealed an army dissolving not through battlefield defeat, but through biological collapse. Reports of cannibalism among Japanese forces in the Philippines emerged from multiple sources. American patrols discovered evidence that some Japanese soldiers, driven to absolute extremity, had consumed flesh from dead comrades. Filipino guerrillas reported similar findings. While such incidents remained relatively rare and were condemned by Japanese officers who retained authority, their occurrence illustrated the desperation starvation created. These weren't acts of cultural practice, but of men whose higher cognitive functions had been destroyed by prolonged malnutrition. American forces advancing through Philippine jungles encountered Japanese soldiers in conditions that shocked combat veterans. Filipino scouts serving with American units reported finding Japanese positions where defenders were too weak to flee or fight, simply waiting passively for death or capture. Medical personnel examining these soldiers found cases of advanced starvation worse than anything seen previously. Some Japanese soldiers weighed less than 70 pounds, their bodies having consumed virtually all available muscle and fat tissue. Many died within hours of receiving medical attention, their organ systems too damaged to process food. The Bataan Peninsula, scene of American defeat in 1942, became a graveyard for Japanese defenders in 1945. Approximately 14,000 Japanese soldiers withdrew into Batan's jungles and mountains in April 1945, attempting to resist American forces that had already recaptured most of Luzon, cut off completely from supply. These troops survived only weeks before starvation rendered them combatant ineffective. American forces systematically cleared the peninsula, encountering Japanese soldiers so weakened they could barely walk, let alone fight. Mindanao, the Philippines' second-largest island, saw similar starvation conditions. Approximately 40,000 Japanese soldiers defended Mindanao against American and Filipino forces beginning in March 1945. Initial Japanese resistance proved fierce, but as weeks passed without resupply, defensive effectiveness collapsed. By June, American patrols found Japanese positions abandoned, their defenders having simply melted into the jungle to search for food. Many never emerged. Post-war surveys discovered scattered remains of soldiers who had died alone in remote areas. The Japanese Navy suffered equally. Warships trapped in Philippine waters by American naval dominance couldn't escape to resupply, and their crews faced slow starvation. Sailors aboard immobilized vessels in Manila Bay subsisted on diminishing stores until those ran out entirely. Some ships' crews abandoned their vessels to forage ashore, where they fared no better than army troops. The once proud combined fleet, or what remained in Philippine waters, was reduced to floating coffins inhabited by dying men. American forces, in stark contrast, maintained full supply throughout the Philippine campaign. The invasion required complex logistics. Every bullet, bandage, beef stew, tin had to be shipped from bases sometimes thousands of miles distant, but American supply officers executed their mission with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers fighting through Philippine jungles received regular rations, supplemented by hot meals, whenever tactical situations permitted. American field hospitals had ample medicines, fresh bandages, and food for patients. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese deprivation couldn't have been more pronounced. Filipino civilians caught between combatants suffered terribly but generally fared better under American occupation than Japanese. American forces distributed emergency food supplies to starving Filipino populations in liberated areas, understanding that winning civilian support required feeding them. Japanese forces, by contrast, often requisitioned Filipino food stocks at gunpoint, creating bitter resentment. Filipino guerrillas, motivated partly by this treatment, actively assisted American forces by providing intelligence, guiding patrols, and ambushing isolated Japanese units. The Philippine campaign's death toll revealed the starvation crisis's magnitude. Of approximately 270,000 Japanese soldiers in the Philippines when MacArthur returned, fewer than 50,000 survived to surrender in August 1945. American combat inflicted significant casualties, perhaps 80,000 killed in action, but starvation and disease killed the majority. Post-war Japanese estimates suggested that over 140,000 soldiers died from non-combat causes, primarily malnutrition and related illnesses. This represented one of military history's greatest catastrophes, an entire army consumed not by enemy action, but by its own logistical failure. August 15th. 1945 arrived with Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender, ending the Pacific War, but not the starvation that had defined it. Across the vast theater where Japanese forces remained in China, Southeast Asia, isolated Pacific islands, in Japan itself, hundreds of thousands of soldiers faced imminent death from hunger, even as fighting ceased. The war's final act became a race to deliver food to starving Japanese troops before malnutrition completed what combat had begun. Allied forces occupying Japan encountered a home population itself near starvation. Japanese civilians, subjected to increasingly severe rationing throughout the war, were consuming perhaps 1,500 calories daily by summer 1945, barely enough to sustain life. Urban populations faced worse conditions than rural areas. City dwellers lacking access to gardens or farms experienced genuine famine conditions. Children showed stunted growth, adults exhibited malnutrition symptoms, and the elderly died in significant numbers from hunger-related causes. Japan's agricultural production had collapsed due to labor shortages, fertilizer scarcity, and American bombing of transportation infrastructure. American occupation authorities faced an immediate humanitarian crisis. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, made feeding Japan a priority second only to demilitarization. The United States began shipping massive food supplies to Japan: wheat, corn, powdered milk, canned goods, distributing them through Japanese government channels to prevent mass starvation. This generosity, motivated partly by humanitarian concern and partly by pragmatic recognition that stable occupation required fed populations, contrasted sharply with the starvation American forces had witnessed among Japanese troops. The accounting of the Pacific War's nutritional catastrophe produced staggering statistics. Japanese military records examined during post-war tribunals and historical research revealed that of approximately 2.3 million Japanese military deaths during World War II, approximately 60%, roughly 1.4 million soldiers and sailors died from starvation, malnutrition-related disease, or combination thereof, rather than direct combat causes. This proportion far exceeded death from deprivation rates in other modern militaries, including Germany's army on the Eastern Front, where perhaps 25% of deaths resulted from non-combat causes. The American military, by comparison, lost approximately 106,000 killed in action in the Pacific theater, with perhaps another 30,000 dying from disease, accidents, and other non-combat causes. American deaths from starvation or malnutrition-related illness numbered in the dozens at most, usually occurring among prisoners held by Japanese forces or troops in unusual circumstances, like the Bataan Death March. The calorie gap had indeed been decisive. Historical analysis conducted in subsequent decades confirmed that logistics, particularly food supply, determined the Pacific War's outcome as much as conventional military factors. Japan entered the conflict with industrial capacity approximately 10% of America's, a disadvantage that extended to agricultural production, shipping tonnage, and supply infrastructure. Japanese military doctrine, emphasizing spiritual strength over material factors, has failed to compensate for these concrete deficiencies. American military doctrine, prioritizing logistics and assuming that well-supplied soldiers fought more effectively than deprived ones, proved correct. The lessons learned from the Pacific War's nutritional dimension influenced post-war military planning worldwide. The United States military institutionalized robust logistics as fundamental doctrine, ensuring that feeding troops remained a primary consideration in all operational planning. Modern American forces deploy with supply chains designed to deliver hot meals even to remote forward positions, reflecting understanding that nutrition directly affects combat capability. Other militaries adopted similar approaches, recognizing that industrial-age warfare requires industrial-scale logistics. For Japan, the starvation experience left profound scars. Japanese veterans, in memoirs and interviews conducted decades after the war, consistently identified hunger as their most traumatic wartime experience, worse than combat, worse than wounds, worse even than witnessing comrades die. The psychological impact of prolonged starvation affected survivors for life, manifesting in food hoarding behaviors, eating disorders, and nightmares about hunger. Japanese society's collective memory of wartime starvation influenced post-war food security policies, with Japan prioritizing agricultural self-sufficiency and maintaining strategic food reserves. The Pacific War's starvation story also revealed uncomfortable truths about military culture and leadership. Japanese officers who sent soldiers into hopeless situations without adequate supplies bore responsibility for their deaths as surely as if they'd shot them. The emphasis on spiritual strength over material reality, the stigmatization of complaints about hunger, the prioritization of ammunition over food, these cultural factors amplified logistical failures into catastrophes. Superior willpower couldn't overcome absent calories, and pretending otherwise killed hundreds of thousands. American abundance, while clearly advantageous, militarily, raised its own questions. The lavish supply system that kept soldiers well-fed required enormous resource expenditure. Shipping space that might have been used for additional weapons or equipment. Some military theorists argued this represented inefficiency, that soldiers could fight effectively on reduced rations. Combat results proved otherwise. Well-fed troops consistently outperformed malnourished opponents, suggesting that investment in comprehensive logistics paid dividends exceeding costs. The calorie gap that decided the Pacific War ultimately reflected deeper national differences in industrial capacity. agricultural productivity, transportation infrastructure, scientific knowledge, and cultural attitudes toward material versus spiritual factors. Japan fought a modern industrial war with pre-industrial logistics assumptions, assuming warrior spirit could substitute for absent food. The United States approached warfare as an industrial problem requiring industrial solutions, including feeding millions of soldiers adequately regardless of cost. History judged which approach succeeded. 75 years after the Pacific War's end, military planners still study the starvation campaigns that characterized the conflict. Modern warfare remains intensely logistical. Precision weapons and advanced technology haven't eliminated the fundamental requirement that soldiers must eat to function. The lesson remains relevant. Victory belongs to nations that can sustain their forces in the field, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance compensates for empty stomachs. The Japanese soldiers who starved on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines died not from lack of fighting spirit, but from their nation's inability to deliver something as basic as daily bread. That prosaic failure, multiplied across millions of individual tragedies, shaped the Pacific War's outcome as decisively as any battle. The rice bowls and mess tins, full or empty, mattered as much as rifles and battleships.